Okay, so I have a couple of GDP forecast models, and in normal times these models are good. Very good. Indeed, when you look back at the forecast versus actual US real GDP from 2016 to 2020, you'll see that it's pretty much bang on, and things were looking pretty good. Okay, probably one of the weakest expansions. Let me just say the grey bars on these charts, they indicate the previous recessions. So let's take a look at some of the headlines. We had the equity market making record highs, unemployment approaching the lows, and inflation was under control around the 2% target. Indeed, the theme of the last 40 years has been the containment of inflation and the fall of government bond yields across the developed world. And then along came the coronavirus, COVID-19. 1/3 of the global population on shutdown. So I shocked the GDP models. I gave them the sort of shocks we saw in the 2008 global financial crisis. And the question I wanted to ask was how many quarters of shocks could the economy absorb? Surprisingly, after 2 quarters, things seem to bounce back quite quickly. There is, however, one caveat here. Are we dealing with an extreme event, or is this now the new norm? Let's go back to the end of 2001, the bursting of the dot-com bubble and the 9/11 attacks. Inflation fell to 1.5%, its lowest reading since 1986, and before that, 1964. The Fed funds effective rate plunged from 6% to 1.8%. Greenspan then held Fed funds effective rate below 2% until November 2004. And it worked. By 2005, inflation was back north of 3%. Some say that this sub-2% Fed funds from 2001 to 2004 was too low for too long, and that this caused the housing bubble and the global financial crisis of 2008. Eventually, that bubble burst, and inflation fell much lower. Bernanke took Fed funds to 0% in December 2008, and they stayed there at 0 until Yellen raised 25 basis points on the 17th of December 2015. If Greenspan's 3-year experiment with sub-2% gave rise to the financial crisis, what would this policy of 0% for 7 years do? Added to that were 3 rounds of quantitative easing. M0 increased from 800 billion to 4.1 trillion. Despite all of this, with every major bank trying to provoke inflation, inflation never came, because inflation has little to do with money supply per se. Consumers were saving and paying off their debt. The velocity or turnover of money plunged after 2008, the continuation of a decline that began in 1998. There is one thing that is a central banker's worst nightmare: deflation. Deflation is a black hole that central bankers cannot escape with existing policy tools. Indeed, John Maynard Keynes called it the liquidity trap, and that's what my GDP models are showing. There is a point, a tipping point, and once we get beyond a certain number of quarters, all bets are off. The Fed loses credibility, we're in the deflationary spiral. Remember, these grey bars show the previous recessions. Previous crisis response has been to cut Fed funds by an average of 5.5%. So why is this so important? Well, you see, the Fed has painted itself into a corner. It's been storing up trouble for another day, and that day is here. Frankly, we've run out of monetary policy tools. Just like the Eurozone, Japan and Switzerland, central banks have next to no ammunition via the policy rate channel. A fiscal stimulus is required. But all is not lost, because money supply is dry kindling. It needs a catalyst. Facing one's mortality can help us appreciate life. It's uncanny how SARS and H5N1 came at or near previous recessions. But let me leave you with one thing. The Spanish flu, January 1918 to December 1920. The death toll was somewhere between 17 to 50 million, possibly as many as 100 million. After that came the Roaring Twenties. It was quite a party. Let's just make sure we don't overdo the party this time, because the Great Depression was from 1929 to 1941, and the rest is history.